Some people move through the world with a kind of quiet control that doesn't make sense at first. They don't argue, they don't chase, they don't try to prove anything. They step back, and everything shifts. The energy changes. Conversations feel different. People lean in, question, even chase. Not because something was added, but because something was removed, and that absence carries more weight than any reaction ever could. Most people don't realize how much of their life is spent reacting instead of choosing. Every message answered instantly, every misunderstanding corrected, every emotion expressed the moment it appears. It feels like connection, but more often it's a loss of control disguised as presence. You stay available, you stay responsive, and over time you stop noticing how much of yourself is being shaped by everything around you. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are." But that becomes difficult when your reactions are no longer yours, when every situation pulls something out of you automatically, when your attention is constantly directed outward instead of grounded within. And somewhere in that cycle, without realizing it, you begin to drift away from yourself. There's a moment most people miss, and it happens quietly. It doesn't arrive with noise or warning. It slips in through habit. You start reacting faster than you can notice yourself reacting. Someone says something, and your response is already forming. Someone pulls away, and you feel the urge to close the distance. Someone misunderstands you, and you rush to explain, to fix, to correct. It feels natural, automatic, but that's the problem. What feels natural is often just repetition. A pattern you've practiced so many times, it no longer feels like a choice. Over time, this becomes your default. You stop pausing, you stop questioning, you move from one reaction to another, as if your role is to maintain balance in every situation. You reply quickly, you smooth things over, you adjust yourself constantly, and without realizing it, you begin to measure your worth by how available you are. It feels like responsibility. It feels like maturity, but underneath it, something else is happening. Because if your value truly came from always being available, it wouldn't leave you feeling drained. It wouldn't create that quiet exhaustion at the end of the day. It wouldn't feel like you're living slightly behind yourself, always reacting instead of choosing. That feeling is not random. It's a signal, not that you're doing too little, but that you're giving too much without awareness. And when you stay with that long enough, a pattern begins to reveal itself. The more available you are, the less your presence is actually felt. Not because people don't care, but because constant access removes contrast. What is always there becomes expected, and what is expected rarely holds value. You become predictable, easy to reach, easy to read, easy to rely on. And while that might sound like a strength, it quietly changes how people engage with you. They stop noticing your presence because it's always there. They stop valuing your attention because it's always given. This isn't something people consciously decide. It's something that forms over time. You respond quickly, so they expect quick responses. You explain yourself, so they question more. You stay available, so they stop considering whether they should reach out. And slowly, without any clear moment of change, your presence shifts from something chosen to something assumed. That's where Stoic thinking cuts through the illusion. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you always have the option of not engaging, but most people don't exercise that option, not because they can't, but because they've forgotten it exists. Part of the reason is discomfort. Silence feels wrong at first. Not responding feels like losing control. There's tension in not explaining yourself, in not correcting what's been misunderstood, in not stepping in when something feels unresolved. That tension is real, but it's also revealing. It shows how much your sense of stability depends on how others see you. When you feel the need to fix every perception, to manage every interaction, to respond to every signal, it means your center has slowly shifted outward. You're no longer grounded in your own awareness. You're anchored in how others react to you. And once you start seeing that clearly, something shifts. You begin to notice how people learn to interact with you based on how you respond. If pressure gets a reaction, it will be used again. If doubt gets an explanation, it will return. If distance makes you move closer, it will repeat. Not because people are calculating, but because it works. Patterns form where consistency exists. And if your reactions are predictable, the dynamic becomes predictable too. But the moment you interrupt that pattern, even slightly, everything changes. You pause instead of responding immediately. You stay silent instead of explaining. You step back instead of moving closer. And in that pause, something new appears. Space. The space between what happens and how you respond. And in that space, you finally have a choice. Not a forced reaction, not a habitual response, a real decision. And that's where control begins, not over others, but over yourself. At first, that change feels uncomfortable. Things feel slightly off. People notice, some question it, some resist it. And you might question yourself too. It can feel like you're becoming distant, like you're doing something wrong. But look closer. You're not withdrawing from people, you're withdrawing from patterns. You're no longer giving your attention automatically. You're no longer responding without thinking. And that creates friction, because people are used to the version of you that required less effort to access. That's where many people fall back. Not because the old way was better, but because it was familiar. But discomfort isn't a signal to retreat. It's a sign that something is changing. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Much of the discomfort you feel isn't coming from what's actually happening. It's coming from what you think might happen if you don't respond, if you don't explain, if you don't engage. But when you sit with that discomfort instead of escaping it, you begin to see it more clearly, and it starts to lose its power. As this continues, something deeper begins to form. You start observing more than reacting. You notice who respects your silence and who tries to break it. You see who only reaches out when they need something, and who remains present without expectation. These patterns were always there. You just couldn't see them clearly before because you were too involved in maintaining them. And from that awareness, a different kind of strength begins to emerge. Not loud, not forceful, but steady. You don't feel the need to respond to everything anymore. You don't feel pulled in every direction. Your presence becomes more intentional, more grounded. Carl Jung spoke about making the unconscious conscious, because until you do, it will direct your life. And this is exactly what begins to happen. You start to see your patterns instead of living inside them, and once you see them, they lose their automatic hold over you. Eventually, the silence changes. It no longer feels empty, it becomes clear. You stop feeling the need to fill every gap, to respond to every signal, to stay involved in every situation. And something unexpected happens. You begin to feel lighter, not because the world has changed, but because your relationship to it has. You're no longer reacting to everything. You're choosing where your energy goes. And in that choice, you reclaim something most people don't even realize they've lost: control. Not over others, not over outcomes, but over yourself. And when that happens, everything shifts. Not because you forced it to, but because you stopped giving yourself away without awareness. If this is starting to resonate, if something here feels familiar in a way that's hard to ignore, then take that seriously, because awareness is where change begins. And if you want to keep building that awareness, to keep refining how you think, how you respond, how you move through the world, then subscribing isn't just clicking a button. Subscribing is a quiet decision to understand yourself more clearly, one step at a time. At first, this can feel confusing. You give more, yet it feels like you're receiving less. You respond quickly, yet your responses seem to carry less weight. You show up consistently, yet your presence doesn't create the same impact it once did. It's not that people don't care, it's that they've adapted. Human nature adjusts quickly to what is reliable. And when you are always available, You become part of that reliability. Something stable, something assumed. And while stability is often seen as a strength, when it lacks boundaries, it turns into something else entirely, something that no longer stands out. This is where the subtle shift in perception begins. You become the person who is always there, always understanding, always willing to engage, and while that may sound like a positive identity, it carries an invisible cost. Because when people know you will always respond, they stop considering whether they should reach out. When they know you will always explain, they stop trying to understand on their own. And when they know you will always be present, they stop recognizing your presence as something valuable, not out of disrespect, but out of familiarity. Familiarity, when unchecked, dulls appreciation. It turns something meaningful into something routine, and routines, by their nature, don't demand attention. They don't create pause. They don't invite reflection. They simply exist. That's why the more you give without pause, the more it becomes woven into the expectations of others. You're no longer offering something. You're fulfilling something, a role, a pattern, a function within the dynamic. And this happens quietly. There's no moment where someone decides to take advantage of you, no clear shift where things suddenly change. It builds gradually, shaped by repetition. You respond quickly once, then again, then again. You explain yourself when misunderstood, then do it again the next time. You stay available even when it drains you, reinforcing the idea that this is simply who you are. Over time, that pattern becomes the default, not just for others, but for you as well. That's the part most people miss. It's not just about how others see you. It's about how you begin to see yourself. You start to believe that this constant availability is necessary, that if you stop, something will break, that if you don't respond, you might lose connection, that if you don't explain, you might be misunderstood in a way you can't recover from. And so you continue, not because it feels right, but because stopping feels uncertain. But uncertainty isn't always a problem. Sometimes it's a signal, a sign that you're stepping outside of what has become automatic. Because when everything you offer is constantly accessible, it loses its sense of intention. It's no longer something you choose, it's something you provide by default. And anything provided by default eventually stops being questioned. But if that's true, then why does it feel so difficult to hold back? Why does silence feel heavier than response? Why does stepping away feel like losing something, even when staying costs you more? The answer isn't found in logic alone. It sits deeper in the habits you've built and the expectations you've internalized. Because over time, reacting becomes more than a behavior. It becomes a way of maintaining control, or at least the illusion of it. Responding quickly feels like staying in control of the situation. Explaining yourself feels like controlling how you're perceived. Staying available feels like controlling the connection. But these forms of control are fragile. They depend on constant input, constant adjustment, constant engagement. And the moment you stop, even briefly, it feels like everything might shift in a way you can't manage. Yet that shift is exactly where something new begins, because when you stop filling every space with reaction, you create room for something else. Observation, clarity, distance. Not the kind of distance that disconnects you, but the kind that allows you to see what's actually happening without being pulled into it immediately. And from that place, patterns become clearer. You start to notice how often your responses were unnecessary, how many situations resolved themselves without your involvement when you gave them time, how often your silence carried more weight than your words ever did. It doesn't happen all at once. It builds slowly, through small moments where you choose not to react the way you always have. That's where the dynamic begins to change. Not because you've forced anything, but because you've stepped out of the pattern that sustained it. And once that happens, even subtly, the way others interact with you starts to adjust. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. Because when you stop being constantly available, your presence is no longer assumed. It becomes something that has to be noticed again. Part of the answer begins in a place most people try to avoid: discomfort. Not the loud, obvious kind, but the quiet tension that shows up when you choose not to react the way you usually do. Silence feels heavier than it should. Not responding feels unnatural, almost like you're doing something wrong. There's a pull to explain yourself, to correct what was misunderstood, to step back into the interaction, just to restore a sense of normalcy. And that pull can feel strong, almost urgent, as if something important is at risk the longer you resist it. But that feeling isn't random. It's not just about the situation in front of you. It's a reflection of something deeper that has been built over time. Because when you're used to being responsive, used to being available, used to managing how others perceive you, stepping out of that pattern creates friction. Not because silence is wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. And anything unfamiliar tends to feel uncomfortable, even when it's necessary. There's a subtle kind of tension in letting a moment pass without interference, in not clarifying something that could easily be clarified, in not defending yourself when you feel slightly misrepresented. It feels like you're leaving something unresolved, like you're giving up control over how the situation unfolds. And in a way, you are, but not in the way it seems. You're not losing control of the situation. You're stepping out of the illusion that you were controlling it in the first place. Because control, when it depends on constant reaction, is fragile. It requires continuous effort, continuous adjustment, continuous involvement. And the moment you stop feeding it, it feels like it might collapse. That's why silence feels so uncomfortable at first. It removes the illusion of control and replaces it with something more honest: uncertainty. And most people are not comfortable sitting in uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it. This is where the deeper realization begins to form. The discomfort isn't just about silence, it's about what silence exposes. It reveals how dependent you've become on being seen a certain way, on being understood immediately, on being perceived as consistent, reliable, agreeable. And while those qualities are not inherently negative, the need to maintain them at all times becomes limiting. It turns something flexible into something rigid. Epictetus understood this tension well. He said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." There's a kind of freedom hidden in that idea, but it doesn't feel like freedom at first. It feels like exposure, like letting go of the need to immediately correct how you're perceived, like allowing others to sit with their interpretation of you without stepping in to adjust it. And that can feel uncomfortable, especially if you've spent years refining how you present yourself. But the more you sit with that discomfort, the more something begins to shift. You start to realize that not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Not every perception needs to be managed. Not every moment requires your input. And as that realization settles in, the urge to react begins to loosen. Not completely, not all at once, but enough for you to notice that you have more space than you thought. That space is where choice begins to return. Because when you're no longer reacting automatically, you're no longer being pulled in every direction by external triggers. You're able to observe the situation, feel the impulse to respond, and still decide whether that response is necessary. And sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the most effective action is no action at all. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent or disconnected. It means becoming selective. It means recognizing that your energy, your attention, and your presence are not unlimited resources. They carry weight, and where you direct them matters. But if you're constantly reacting, constantly engaging, constantly explaining, you don't give yourself the opportunity to decide where that energy should go. At first, this selectivity can feel uncomfortable. It can feel like you're holding back, like you're not doing enough. But over time, it begins to feel different. It starts to feel intentional, grounded, steady. You're no longer responding because you feel you have to. You're responding because you've chosen to. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, changes the way you move through every interaction. Because when you're no longer driven by the need to manage how others see you, you start to see yourself more clearly. You begin to understand your own patterns, your own impulses, your own tendencies to over-engage. And from that understanding, you gain something that can't be forced or faked. Control that doesn't rely on constant action. And once you experience that, even briefly, the discomfort that once pushed you to react begins to lose its grip. It doesn't disappear completely, but it becomes something you can sit with, observe, and move through without immediately trying to resolve it. And in that ability, something important takes shape. You're no longer reacting to maintain your place in the world. You're choosing how you show up in it. This isn't about blaming others. It's about seeing the dynamic clearly, because once something works consistently, it becomes predictable, and predictability shapes behavior. People adjust to what they can rely on, and if your reactions are always the same, they don't need to think about how to approach you. They already know. They already expect it. Over time, the interaction stops being conscious and becomes automatic on both sides. You respond without thinking, and they engage without questioning. That's where awareness becomes important. Not to criticize yourself, but to recognize the pattern for what it is. You're not just responding to situations, you're shaping them. Every reaction reinforces something. Every immediate response confirms a dynamic. And when those reactions are consistent, they create a kind of silent agreement about how things will continue. Not spoken, not deliberate, but understood through repetition. What makes this difficult to notice is that it feels normal. It feels like you're simply being yourself, simply responding in a way that makes sense. But when you step back, even slightly, you begin to see how much of that normal is built on habit rather than choice. You start to recognize that the way you've been responding isn't the only way you could respond. It's just the way you've practiced the most. And that's where something begins to shift. Not externally at first, but internally. You start to notice the moment between what happens and how you react to it. A small pause appears. Maybe just a second, maybe less. But it's enough to feel the difference. Enough to realize that your response doesn't have to be immediate. That it doesn't have to follow the same pattern it always has. This space, small, almost invisible, is where control begins to return. Because in that space, you're no longer being carried by habit. You're observing it. You're aware of the impulse to react, but you're not fully inside it. And that awareness gives you something you didn't have before, a choice. At first, using that choice feels unfamiliar. You hesitate. You pause where you would normally respond. You let a moment pass without filling it. And that pause can feel uncomfortable, almost unnatural, but it also feels different. There's a sense of separation, a distance between you and the situation that wasn't there before. You're no longer fully immersed in it. You're seeing it from the outside, even if only slightly. And as you begin to use that space more often, the dynamic starts to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. When you don't react the way you always have, people notice. Maybe not consciously, but something feels different to them. The pattern they were used to is no longer consistent. The predictability fades, and when predictability fades, attention returns. Because now your response is no longer guaranteed. It's no longer automatic. It becomes something that has to be observed again, something that isn't immediately known. And that changes how others approach you. They become more aware, more cautious, not necessarily in a negative way, but in a way that reflects the shift in the dynamic. At the same time, something changes within you. You begin to feel less pulled by situations, less controlled by the need to respond. You notice that not every comment requires a reply. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Not every moment needs your involvement. And that realization creates a sense of steadiness that wasn't there before. There's a quiet strength in that, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that holds its ground without needing to prove anything, the kind that doesn't rush to respond, doesn't rush to explain, doesn't rush to fix. And that strength comes from something simple: awareness of your own patterns and the willingness to step outside them. Because when you don't react immediately, the situation often changes on its own. It settles, it loses intensity. What felt urgent begins to feel manageable, and in that shift, your response, if you choose to give one, comes from a different place. Not from impulse, but from clarity. That's where the real change happens, not just in how others interact with you, but in how you experience those interactions. You're no longer caught in the same loop of reaction and response. You're no longer reinforcing the same patterns. You're creating something new, something less predictable, something more grounded. And as that continues, the space between stimulus and response becomes more familiar, less uncomfortable, more natural. It becomes a place you return to, not avoid. A place where you pause, observe, and decide. And in that place, something important settles in. You're no longer just reacting to the world around you. You're choosing how you engage with it. And that distinction matters. Because you're not withdrawing from people. You're withdrawing from patterns that no longer serve you. You're creating space between what happens and how you respond. You're allowing yourself to pause, to observe, to choose. And that space, while quiet, changes everything. It interrupts the flow that once carried you from one reaction to the next without question. But interruption creates friction, not because something is wrong, but because something is different. People who are used to reaching you easily may find that it now takes more effort. People who relied on your immediate responses may feel the delay, and even if they don't consciously understand it, they feel the shift. The version of you they were interacting with is no longer consistent in the same way. And inconsistency, especially when it replaces predictability, can be uncomfortable. That discomfort doesn't just belong to others. You feel it too, in the quiet moments where you choose not to engage, in the pauses where you allow things to unfold without stepping in the space where you resist the urge to return to what feels familiar. It's a different kind of experience, one that doesn't offer immediate reassurance. And because of that, it's easy to misinterpret it as something negative. This is where many people turn back, not because they've thought it through and decided it's wrong, but because the discomfort feels easier to escape than to understand. They return to responding quickly, to explaining themselves, to filling every silence, and for a moment, things feel normal again. The friction disappears, the dynamic returns to what it was, but so does the underlying pattern, the same exhaustion, the same lack of control, the same quiet sense that something isn't quite right. The Stoics approached discomfort differently. They didn't see it as something to avoid, but as something to examine, a signal not of danger, but of change. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." There's a kind of simplicity in that idea, but it requires discipline to live by it. Because it means choosing what is right over what is comfortable. It means allowing yourself to feel the tension of change without immediately trying to resolve it. And when you begin to do that, something shifts internally. The discomfort doesn't disappear, but it becomes easier to sit with. It becomes something you can observe rather than something that controls you. You start to recognize that the urge to return to old habits isn't a sign that those habits were right. It's a sign that they were familiar. Familiarity has a strong pull. It creates a sense of safety, even when the pattern itself isn't beneficial. But when you step outside of it, even briefly, you begin to see it more clearly. You notice how automatic your responses used to be, how little space there was between stimulus and reaction, and how much of your behavior was shaped by expectation rather than intention. As that awareness grows, the friction begins to feel different, less like resistance and more like adjustment. You're not fighting against something, you're realigning. You're allowing your responses to come from a place of choice rather than habit. And while that process isn't always smooth, it's steady. It moves in a direction that feels more grounded, even if it takes time to fully settle into it. At the same time, your interactions begin to change in subtle ways. People who are used to immediate access may start to approach you differently. Some may respect the shift without fully understanding it. Others may push against it, testing whether the old pattern will return. But because you're no longer responding in the same way, the dynamic doesn't reset as easily. It evolves. And in that evolution, something important becomes clear. Your presence carries more weight when it's not constant. Your words matter more when they're not immediate. Your attention feels different when it's given intentionally rather than automatically. It's no longer just there, it's chosen. That choice is what creates the change. Not withdrawal for the sake of distance, but selectivity for the sake of clarity. You're no longer everywhere all the time, for everyone. You're present where it matters, when it matters, and in a way that reflects your own awareness rather than external demand. A sense that you are no longer moving through interactions on autopilot, that you are no longer defined by how quickly you respond or how consistently you are available, that you are, in a quiet and deliberate way, choosing how you show up. And once that choice becomes clear, even in small moments, it changes the way everything else unfolds. As this way of moving through the world becomes more consistent, something deeper begins to take shape beneath the surface. It's not dramatic, it doesn't announce itself, but it changes how you experience everything. You start observing more than reacting. Moments that once pulled you in immediately now pass through a layer of awareness first. You notice things you didn't notice before. Patterns that used to feel normal begin to stand out, not because the world has changed, but because your position within it has shifted slightly. That shift creates distance, but not the kind that disconnects you. It's a distance that allows you to see clearly. You begin to notice who reaches out only when they need something, not in a judgmental way, but in a factual one. The timing becomes obvious, the pattern repeats, and because you're no longer responding automatically, you have the space to see it without immediately stepping into it. That alone changes the interaction. It gives you a choice where there used to be none. At the same time, you begin to notice something else. There are people who respect your silence. They don't push. They don't demand immediate responses. They allow space without trying to fill it. And then there are those who react to that same silence with discomfort. They try to break it. They push for explanations. They look for ways to pull you back into the pattern you've stepped out of. Not necessarily out of bad intention, but because your change disrupts what they were used to. This contrast becomes clearer the more you observe. You start to see how different people respond to the same shift in you. Some adjust naturally, others resist. And in that difference, you begin to understand something important. Your previous way of being wasn't just affecting you, it was shaping how others interacted with you. And now that you've stepped out of that pattern, the dynamic reveals itself more honestly. There's a kind of clarity that comes with this. Not the kind that answers every question, but the kind that removes confusion. You no longer feel the need to interpret everything emotionally. You see behavior as behavior, patterns as patterns. You don't rush to assign meaning where there may be none, and that alone creates a sense of steadiness that didn't exist before. This steadiness is different from what most people think of as strength. It's not loud. It doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't rely on constant action or reaction. It's quiet, consistent. It holds its position without needing validation. And because of that, it carries weight in a way that is difficult to explain, but easy to feel. You begin to notice it in how you respond, or don't respond. There's less urgency, less need to correct, to engage, to manage. You're not pulled into every situation the same way, And when you do choose to engage, it comes from a place that feels more grounded, more deliberate, not driven by impulse, but by awareness. This is where a different kind of presence begins to emerge, one that doesn't depend on constant expression to be felt. You don't need to speak as much for your words to matter. You don't need to be involved in everything to be recognized. There's a sense of control that comes not from doing more, but from doing less with intention. And that shift changes how others perceive you, even if they can't explain it. Your silence is no longer empty. It carries meaning. Your absence is no longer unnoticed. It creates space that others become aware of, not because you're trying to create an effect, but because you're no longer filling every moment automatically. That stability doesn't depend on how others respond to you. It doesn't fluctuate with external reactions. It comes from knowing that your actions are chosen, not automatic. And that creates a kind of confidence that is quieter but stronger than anything built on constant validation. Seneca expressed this idea with clarity. It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor. When your sense of value depends on constant interaction, constant response, constant acknowledgement, it creates a kind of dependence. But when you begin to step back from that, when you stop needing every response, every interaction, every form of engagement, something shifts. You begin to feel less pulled by what others do or don't do. Their actions still matter, but they don't control your state in the same way. You're not waiting for responses. You're not driven by the need to maintain every connection at all times. You're present when you choose to be, and absent when you need to be, and both feel intentional. This doesn't mean you become distant or detached in a negative way. It means you become selective. You recognize that your energy has limits and that where you place it matters. You begin to invest it where it aligns with your values rather than where it's simply expected. And as that becomes more natural, the strength you've developed becomes more stable. It's no longer something you're trying to maintain. It's something that exists on its own. It doesn't require constant effort. It doesn't depend on external confirmation. It simply is. That's the point where the shift becomes fully internal, where you're no longer reacting to maintain balance, but choosing how to engage based on clarity. And in that clarity, something settles. A sense that you are no longer being shaped by every situation, but moving through them with a steady center. And from that center, everything else begins to look different. Eventually, the silence that once felt heavy begins to change its meaning. What used to feel like something missing starts to feel like something gained. The urge to fill every gap fades, not because you're forcing it to, but because you no longer feel the same pressure. Moments that once demanded a response now pass without urgency. You notice them, but you don't feel pulled into them. And in that shift, something becomes clear. You were never required to respond to everything. You only believed you were. That belief loses its hold gradually. It doesn't disappear all at once. At first, you still feel the impulse to engage, to explain, to step in. But it becomes easier to let that impulse pass without acting on it. You begin to see that not every silence needs to be filled. Not every situation needs your involvement. Not every interaction needs to be maintained. And with that realization, something inside you begins to settle. There's a kind of lightness that comes with this. Not the kind that comes from avoiding responsibility, but the kind that comes from releasing what was never yours to carry. You're no longer managing every perception, no longer maintaining every connection, no longer responding to every signal as if it requires your attention. That constant pressure begins to lift, and in its place, there's space. That space changes how you move through the world. You're not rushing from one interaction to another. You're not trying to keep everything in balance at all times. You're simply present where you are without feeling the need to extend yourself beyond what is necessary. And that presence feels different. It's quieter, but more grounded, less reactive, but more aware. At the same time, your relationship with energy becomes clearer. You begin to notice where it goes, how it's used, and how it feels when it's spent intentionally versus automatically. There's a difference between engaging because you choose to and engaging because you feel you have to. One leaves you steady, the other leaves you drained. And once you've experienced that difference, it becomes difficult to ignore. That direction creates a sense of control, but not the kind that tries to dominate situations or people. It's a quieter form of control, one that exists internally. You're not trying to shape everything around you. You're simply deciding how you engage with it. And that decision is enough. It shifts your experience without requiring anything external to change. That's where the real change happens, not in what others do, but in how you relate to it. Situations that once pulled you in no longer have the same effect. Comments that once stayed in your mind lose their weight more quickly. Interactions that once felt urgent now feel optional. And in that shift, your experience becomes more stable. You're no longer being moved in every direction by external forces. You're choosing where to stand, where to move, where to engage. And that choice brings a kind of consistency that isn't dependent on anything outside of you. It doesn't fluctuate with circumstances. It doesn't require constant adjustment. It simply holds. This doesn't mean life becomes completely calm or predictable. There are still moments of tension, still situations that require attention. But your relationship to those moments is different. You're not reacting immediately. You're observing first. You're allowing space before deciding how to respond. And that space changes everything. Because in that space, you're no longer giving yourself away automatically. You're no longer responding out of habit. You're choosing. And that choice, repeated over time, becomes a new pattern, one that is based on awareness rather than impulse. As this becomes more natural, the earlier discomfort feels distant, not because it was unnecessary, but because it was part of the transition. It marked the point where you began stepping out of old patterns and into something more deliberate. And now, that deliberate way of moving feels stable, familiar in a different way. You no longer feel the need to prove your presence. It's understood without constant expression. You no longer feel the need to maintain every connection. The ones that matter remain without effort, and the ones that don't begin to fade without resistance. There's a clarity in that, even if it's quiet. And with that clarity comes a different kind of confidence, not based on how others respond to you, but on how you respond to yourself, on your ability to pause, to observe, to choose. That ability becomes something you rely on, something that stays with you regardless of what's happening around you. That's the point where everything begins to feel different. Not because the world has changed, but because your relationship to it has. You're no longer pulled in every direction. You're not reacting to everything that happens. You're choosing where your energy goes, where your attention rests, where your presence is placed. And in that choice, you reclaim something that was always yours, but often overlooked. Control, not over others, not over outcomes, but over yourself. And that form of control doesn't require force. It doesn't need to be maintained constantly. It exists quietly, shaping how you move through everything without needing to be seen. Once that becomes clear, the need to be constantly available begins to fade completely. Not as a rule, not as a restriction, but as a natural result of understanding. You don't need to withdraw from everything. You simply stop giving yourself away without awareness. And from that point forward, every interaction, every response, every moment carries a different weight. Not heavier, but more intentional, more aligned, more yours. At some point, it stops being about silence and starts being about who you become in it. Not someone distant, not someone cold, but someone who is no longer controlled by every impulse, every expectation, every demand. Someone who chooses, and in that choice finds a kind of peace that doesn't depend on anyone else. If this message stayed with you, then don't break that momentum. Watch one of the videos on your screen right now and keep building that awareness step by step. And truly, thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal.